Hi everybody, this is Mr. I again, and this week we're going to be talking about how you implement object-oriented programming inside a Python program. Some of you have already done this with other languages. Perhaps you've used Java or C++ or C# or JavaScript or one of the other languages that supports the creation of classes. It's a very useful concept, and we're going to see how to do that in Python as well. In order to be able to do this, I'm going to go through in this video a number of syntax points, and then there will be another video where we will go right into our idle program and type some things in and see what's happening, explore what's going on. It's vitally important that when you get to that one, you actually play along, open up idle, do the exercises with me, because you're only going to learn this if you get some practice at it. So let's go. Whenever we talk about object-oriented programming, we talk about classes and objects. You can think of a class as the blueprint for a set of objects that all share common characteristics. And then an object is an instance of a class. So for example, you might have a class of schools, and they might be all the schools that people in this Python course attend. And the objects might be the various schools themselves. You'd have one class, multiple objects that all implement that class. We call the objects instances of a class. Now, we've already used objects and classes in Python. We just didn't call them by those names. For example, we've created variables that were lists. Each of those variables is an object belonging to the class that's called list. Each of them can do things that any list can do. Like maybe you have a list that was called age, gender, and height from our last homework problem. And your list is called age, gender, and height. You could do age, gender, and height dot append. You never wrote anything called append. That comes because age, gender, and height is a member of the list class, and the list has a method called append. A method which is a function like you did last week. So let's see how we do that within Python. What goes into a class? Each class has to have associated with it some data elements, certain pieces of data that every object that's a member of that class has to have its own version of. And some methods, which are functions that can be performed by any object in that class. So here's an example of what we're trying to do before I give you any of the Python syntax for it. Let's say we had a class called school. Well, maybe the data we want to keep for any school is the name of the school, the city of the school, the state it's in, and the students that are enrolled in that school from our Python course. And maybe some of the functions we wanted to perform for any school would be to add a student or to get the time zone for that school. Now here's what some possible school objects could be. Maybe we've got a school object for the Isidore Newman School. The name, see, we had a name as one of the pieces of data we were going to keep. Maybe the name would be Isidore Newman. And the city would be the string New Orleans. And the state would be the string LA for Louisiana, and the students might be a list containing the two strings Ram and Philip, since they are our two students from Isidore Newman. Maybe we've got another object called Harker. It's also a member of the same class. One class called school. Now we're up to two objects in that class. Well, let's go back. I hit page down too soon. The name would be Harker, the city would be San Jose, the state would be California. In this case, the students would just be the list containing one single element, because Nickel is our only student from Harker. And maybe we have another object called the completely made up school. Put in a name, Tinker Toy Tech, make it be from New York, New York, and have an empty list for students. Now, how do we do that in Python? Next page. To define a class, you use the class keyword. Class space name of your class. I'm going to call this class school. Notice the convention is that when you create a class in Python, you will start it with an uppercase letter. There's nothing that forces you to do that. It's just a style point. I will probably do it all the time, as long as I remember. So this says I've got a class called school. I put a colon here because it's starting an indented block, just like we had for if statements and while statements and functions and so on. Now, everything in the indented block underneath the class keyword is part of the class definition. We include one or more functions in this area. They could be functions that we wanted to make up that are unique to school, like get the time zone or add a student, and they can be ones that have special predefined names and meanings, such as this one, which we are going to use, underscore underscore init underscore underscore. Now, next page is an example of doing this for the school class. Class school, colon. Now everything underneath it is indented, so it's part of the class. Until I stop indenting and go back to putting things in column 1, this is all part of the class definition. What have I got here? I'm going to define a function, then I'm going to define another function, then I'm going to define another function. You should be familiar with this syntax from last week's lesson on functions. Here I'm going to define a function called underscore underscore init underscore underscore. As in any function, I put parentheses and say what are the parameters that are being passed in, and then I put a colon. Now, look at this first one. My first parameter I'm calling self. That's something that Python uses to say for every object that's a member of this class called school, here is a pointer to this object's set of data, so that I can keep the Isidore Newman data separate from the Harker data, separate from any other school's data. And then these other parameters are things that you might want to pass in. So maybe I'd be doing self.name equals name. This name on the right-hand side is the parameter that's being passed in. On the left-hand side, when I do self.name, it means this object is going to have a variable attached to the object with the name name, and another one .city, and another one .state, and another one .students. I'm going to initialize the name, city, and state to the name, city, and state that were passed in. And I'm going to initialize the students to just an empty list. I don't pass any students in. I start out with no students. But I'm now going to have a function called add a student. First parameter is also self. Then the next parameter is a student's name. Self.students. This is something that was created up above. Self.students is the list that started out as an empty list, but now I'm going to append to it this student name. And if I call add a student 5 times, I'd be adding 5 elements to my students list. And maybe I've got another function called get time zone. This time all I'm giving it is self, and I check if self.states California, I'll make the time zone be returned as the word Pacific. And if the state was Louisiana, I'll return Central. If the state was New York, I'll return Eastern, and anything else I'll return unknown. Now, what are some of the things that you should notice? Every function must include self as the first parameter. It was here in underscore underscore init underscore underscore. It was here in add a student, and it was here in get time zone. Self.variable is a piece of data associated with a specific instance of the class, a particular object. Each object has its own copy of these variables. The city for the object having to do with Isidore Newman is different than the city for the object having to do with the Harker School, for example. Underscore underscore init underscore underscore is a special function name that's automatically called whenever you create an object of this class. So you're going to have to put one of these in here, and its job is to just initialize the object with some data to get you started. So that's how I create the class. How do I create objects? Let's look. Here I've got something that says Newman equals. I'm going to create a variable called Newman. Now, we've created variables before. We might have said something like x equals 5, or name equals, quote, banana, quote, or something like that. In this case, Newman equals school. This is the name of the class. And then in parentheses, I give it the parameters that my init function needed. Isidore Newman, New Orleans, Louisiana. Name of the school, city of the school, state of the school. Then I could do Newman dot. Newman is a school. It can do anything a school can do. Schools have a function called add a student. So I could do Newman dot add a student and put Ram in there. Newman dot add a student, put Philip in there. Now if I printed out Newman dot students and Newman dot get time zone, what would I get printed out? The list that contained both of my students, Ram and Philip, and whatever the function get time zone returned. In this case, it would return central. And maybe I want to create another object of type school. I've got one called Newman. Now I'm going to have one called Harker. It's going to be a school. Takes 3 parameters, the name, city, state. I'm going to add only one student to this one, Nickel. Print out the Harker students and the time zone, and I get the list that contains one element and Pacific for the time zone. And maybe I'll create a third object called Fake. Fake is going to be a school. It's called Tinker Toy Tech in New York, New York. If I am not adding any students, if I print out fake students and fake get time zone, I'll get an empty list for the students because I never added any, but my init routine started out the students as an empty list, and the time zone will be Eastern because New York is in the Eastern time zone. So that's how we use the class that we've created. Now here's some things for you to be careful of. When you define your functions inside a class, you always need a first parameter that will refer to the object itself. Go back a couple of pages. When we created the class school, the init function, the add a student function, the get time zone function, all had a first parameter called self. The convention among Python programmers is always to call this first parameter self. I want you to get into that habit. There's nothing that forces you to call it self, but every Python programmer you'll ever meet always calls it self. And it's a very meaningful name. Always put in a function called underscore underscore init underscore underscore. That initializes every variable that you'll be using in the class. This gets called automatically. You never do anything that says call the init function. But when we said Harker equals school parenthesis and passed it some parameters, that executed the init function. And when you call a function on an object, do not include self as the first parameter in the call. This is automatically put in by Python. For example, in our add a student in the class, it looked like there were 2 parameters, self and student. But when we called add a student for a particular school, all we passed it was the student name. Python automatically includes a reference to the object and puts it into that self parameter. This is the #1 problem that you're going to have in debugging if you're a beginning Python programmer. You'll either put selfs in where you don't need them or forget to put them in where you do need them. So that's something to keep track of. So what are we going to do next? That's the end of this video, but please watch the next video. Have idle open as you do it. We're going to go through some examples together, and I want you to actually be working along. Thanks, and happy programming.